you've learned something. I hope that you're carrying back with you some information that you didn't know before you got here. And if you were educated, then that's a main mission of this place. Good. Good to hear. Sometimes I call it scaffolding. You've seen so many partners up here, from the city to the chamber to the National Park Service, to contributed that we're not honoring today, but they're a part of this in a huge way. The Indian community, like Annette mentioned earlier, and so a multicultural event maybe in the future might be a good thing to have here. And that way, all the different partners and organizations and scaffolding for this place can come together at an event such as that. Today we're focusing, though, on the Trail of Tears. We're focusing on Sequoyah, because this is just our focus for the day. And so I want to speak a little bit about the history of Sequoyah. Some of you were wanting to hear Charlie Roadharmer. He is also, we've had several people knocked out on travel bans and quarantines, and he has been swept up in that net. And so, as Jessica Harper Brown said, Charlie will be back in this area in the next couple of months, and so we look really forward to greeting him and hearing his official Sequoyah speech at that time. I'm going to talk a little bit about this place and the Trail of Tears. And I think we've all kind of, in Sequoyah, and we've all kind of touched on some of these things. I think Annette touched on this. Sharon talked about it. Larry talked about it. But my talk is going to focus on Sequoyah. And he was born in the Cherokee Overhill village of Tuskegee, circa 1776. Sequoyah's father was thought to be Nathaniel Gist, or Nathaniel Guess. You will see spellings, a couple of different kinds of spellings of the last name. You will also see lots of inaccurate information about Sequoyah. So when you start researching Sequoyah, you really have to dig deep to separate the fact from fiction. Because let's face it, whenever you talk about Cherokee, Native American history, culture, you get a lot of lore that has been mingled in and sold to the public as fact. And the fact is we don't know. We don't know lots of things. And so it's very dangerous to fill in the gaps with what you think and publish it and push it out there as fact. Okay? So all the scholarly people in the audience are shaking their heads. And so I don't want to spread misinformation today. I want to tell you that in advance there are huge gaps in what we know. There's a lot of what we speculate. There are speculations that his father was a surveyor for George Washington. There are speculations that his father was a fur trader, possibly a Scottish fur trader. And so we don't want to push where we don't know. So I'm gonna tell you if there are possibilities of things that we're not too sure about. We do know that Sequoyah was born to a Cherokee mother who was Wootay, it was her name, and she belonged to the Cherokee Paint clan. And we know a little bit about Sequoyah from descriptions of him through the years. We know he was artistic. We know that as a small child, he built small model houses. And that artistic ability just grew as he took on painting portraits of people and animals. So he went from building things to drawing. And eventually he became a silversmith, which there are still some pieces. I have watched some of the antiquities experts on TV talk about some of the Sequoyah silversmithing. And then ultimately he became a blacksmith. And it was during this time as a blacksmith that he began creating symbols because he had to. It was out of necessity. He had to keep up with who owed him money. Okay, so he was apparently a very skilled blacksmith and had lots of business. And if you can't keep records, you lose track of what you've done and who owes you and that sort of thing. So he started creating a number system out of that necessity. Even though the spoken Cherokee language included numbers, there was no official writing So everything was oral tradition, oral stories passed down from generation to generation. We also know that Sequoyah fought under General Andrew Jackson against the British troops and the Creek Indians in the War of 1812. And we know that when Sequoyah returned home, he was committed to creating a writing system for his people. Legend has it that he noticed from the other European troops receiving letters, writing letters, that was something that he thought his people could benefit from, being able to communicate that way. And so he was extremely observant human being and saw a gap in the need for his people. In the 12 years between 1809 and 1821, Sequoyah perfected the language which would eventually bring literacy to his tribe. So as Jessica mentioned earlier, it took about 12 years. He started the work on the syllabary in Tennessee, and he finished it here in Willstown. And so that's where we want to really focus our discussion today. When he first started developing this written language, it was not generally accepted. People didn't understand it. And when people don't understand things, they sometimes ascribe inaccurate or false attributes to what you're doing, right? So people have been misunderstood through history. At one time the world was flat, right? So this is kind of Sequoyah's groundbreaking change in his culture and his communities, was being able to communicate through these symbols. And some people thought it was witchcraft, some people thought it was magic of some sort, because they weren't used to that. You know, thousands and thousands and thousands of years of oral tradition, and all of a sudden you have something different. It was scary to some people. So Sequoyah, the legend has it that Sequoyah was listening to the sounds of birds. And if you ever sit back, my husband and I sit back on our back deck, we live in the Smoky Mountains, and we listen to birds at night, in the evening. And we listen to them talk to each other in the trees. And the legend has it is that he was listening to birds and hearing repetition. And through the repetition of the birds, he started listening to language and paying attention and being very observant. And he noticed repetition in the language. And so when he started creating symbols for the sounds, so it's not an alphabet. A lot of times you'll see Sequoyah's alphabet. It's not an alphabet. It is symbols based off the syllables and the sounds that he was hearing. He ended up creating 87 symbols in the beginning. There were 87 repetitious sounds in the Cherokee language. And he set out to create unique symbols for each one. And he did. He stopped at the sound, so it was a syllabary, not an alphabet. So she became literate. She was really, after Sequoyah's first literate Cherokee. So she learned to read and write with her dad. And so it was through her that saved him, because here in Willstown, George Lowry, which there is an image of George Lowry on our banners, who was the chief of this area, brought Sequoyah to trial for witchcraft. And so he brought together a group of warriors from various communities, Cherokee communities, and they spent quite a bit of time. There's no specific timetable for this, kind of putting Sequoyah on trial. And his daughter was there. And so how he proved to them that this was not magic or sorcery was they separated Sequoyah and his daughter. And they wrote messages to each other carried by these warriors. And finally, after demonstrating that, you know, she couldn't see him and he couldn't see her, and yet they could communicate accurately, George Lowry was convinced that this was indeed a written language. And so the table flipped that week, and those warriors who were assembled ended up being educated. And immediately there was a group of literate Cherokee people who were literate in the Cherokee language that was now able to go out to their communities And within months, the Cherokee people were literate in their own language. And so, when scholars have gone back through the history of the world, you have groups of people who created alphabets and groups of people who have worked on written language, but you've never had one person who came up with a language for an entire people. And so this is something that is extremely fantastic and unique about Sequoyah. How did Sequoyah get here? So Sequoyah was living in Tennessee in around present-day Tellico Plains. Some of you may have been there. This is also where the Sequoyah Birthplace Museum is located. And there was extreme pressure in East Tennessee. They were constantly being invaded by white European invaders who had come into the Cherokee Nation. It was illegal to come into the Cherokee Nation at that time. You had to have a passport to come into the Cherokee Nation, the boundaries of the nation. So it was illegal for people to come in and raid them. So their crops were being burned, their cattle and livestock was being stolen, their horses were being stolen, and so they were really being terrorized. And many people would have to flee their homes in the middle of the night and hide because of the burning that was taking place of their property. And so there was extreme pressure. There was also pressure from the state of Georgia. The Cherokee in the state of Georgia were not able to assemble anymore. Their leaders, it was illegal in the state of Georgia for their leaders to assemble. And so what happened was, from the pressure from East Tennessee and Georgia, this place became a very inviting community for Cherokee people to settle. They were already here, they were already living here, and yet the community bloomed. And that's where you get the mission school, and they had business, they had homes, they had farms. And so you have groups of people who settled here, remade their homes. They'd already had their home places where they were originally living, and then they came here, started other home places, and then were removed on the Trail of Tears. So they were displaced multiple times here. And so this is a place of extreme sadness. One of the things that this place, Manitowoc Cave, can do now as a certified interpretive center is this can be the hub for telling the story about Willstown. So maps, having people come here first, and then being able to send them to George Lowry's, the location of his house, the Andrew Ross house, the Willstown Mission Cemetery. There are so many sites that are even forthcoming that Jessica may have pointed out that are still left to be mapped on this trail route. And so we are still in that work, and the Trail of Tears Association is still in that work. And so we hope that this just becomes that hub to tell the story. And as a certified interpretive center, that's exactly what it can do. So we actually have a descendant of Andrew Ross in our audience. Joseph Joey Ross is over to my right, to your left. He is a Cherokee Nation citizen in Oklahoma and is a descendant of Andrew Ross, Sequoyah, and George Lowry. So these families were interconnected here. You can read in the history books that oftentimes they married different descendants of their children were intermarrying. I mean, this mission school was marrying people, educating people, baptizing people. This was community. And so those families were intertwined. So we appreciate you coming from Oklahoma, from Arizona, actually, and family in Oklahoma. So we appreciate that. And so someone did point out that they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave. There is actually a sign in Alabama, and I won't say which city, that talks about the Chickasaw joyfully walking to their new homes in Oklahoma. It uses the word joyfully. This is interpretive signage from our past. This is interpretive signage that we now struggle to change in our state. changing history, burying history, trying to make it these horrible genocidal events appear mild is something that has been a travesty in our history books and in our signage in the past. And so the Trail of Tears Association, you scholars that are dedicated to bring the truth out, is how we work towards accepting our past and apologizing for our past and moving forward into the future, but letting people who are the center of those cultures tell their story. My husband is an Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian citizen, Dr. Bud Smith. He's back there. He and I met as a result of some of my work with the Trail of Tears and trying to get it right. One thing that I think we have done and that I speak about regularly is interpretation from people outside of the culture. I was raised in a Caucasian family, and I was not raised in a Native family, and yet I have worked with Native interpretation since the early 2000s. And one of the things that I think that we have done wrong is not authentically bringing the tribes in to tell their stories. Even though as a scholarly person I have worked in archaeology and history for many, many years, I have completely missed the boat on so many things and so many levels. And even attempting to do the right thing, trying my hardest to do the right thing, researching it as much as I can, I still don't have that concept of the culture. And so, to me, I now advocate we got to get the tribes central to telling their stories. We have got to get tribal scholars and tribal people central to telling their stories. And this goes for any cultural community that we are working on. You know, whether it's civil rights, whether it's African American communities, we have got to get those cultures front and center, because we miss the soul of the interpretation, and we miss the soul of the story when we do that, when we take that over. And this is why so much signage is incorrect in our states, and why our textbooks are incorrect, or they pay this much attention to the Trail of Tears when that should be common knowledge. I was speaking at a magnet school of gifted children in Alabama several years ago, and I had a child raise his hand and quite honestly and sincerely said, "Aren't the Native Americans extinct?" Okay, so things like this, places like this, and opportunities like this are where telling the story becomes extremely central and important. This Fort Payne, getting the story out into the schools, into the community, into the museums. We've already been reached out by the Train Depot Museum saying we want to partner. We want to partner on this project so that we can tell the story and send them back to you guys. It's important, and this story of this place is important. Sequoyah ended up leaving before the Trail of Tears, so he was not on the binge attachment. The binge detachment is the detachment that left Fort Payne heading to Oklahoma, and there is tons of history on the binge detachment. It is not hidden. You don't have to make up lore to learn about the binge detachment. There is a report on the Trail of Tears Association website that Sharon Freeman worked on and Larry Smith worked on that had to do with the binge detachment and removal ports in Alabama. And I think it's titled Removal Ports in Alabama, but it has the binge detachment in it. It is a 600-page report. So if you're planning on downloading it and printing it, I would recommend sending that to a company that does that. But that is a publication that is scholarly. It is solid. Gail King was one of the presidents of the Trail of Tears Association Alabama chapter. She was in charge of that report. It was done in conjunction with the National Park Service, and it is an incredible publication. If you ever want to pick it up, I have never seen anything like it on removal in Alabama. But Sequoyah left early. Sequoyah did not leave on the bench detachment. A lot of people think that he was on the bench detachment. He was not. He left before the bench detachment. He kind of saw the writing on the wall. He was like, I have, experienced this in Tennessee. I'm experiencing this in Alabama. I'm going to go ahead. So he left ahead of the Trail of Tears. Now his son, Nathaniel Guest, has signed the cave walls. And you can read a little bit more about that on the banners that we had published. Nathaniel, not Nathaniel yet. Yeah, his son. And I'm sorry, my notes are all over the place, and I have been reading about this for so long. So the signatures inside the cave come from different people. Richard, not Nathaniel. Nathaniel was his father. Richard Guest. So Richard was an interesting person because Richard was one of the conductors on the bench detachment. All right, so he was an important leader in this community. He did not remove before the bench detachment. He was a conductor was a person who looked after the well-being of the people on the detachment. So this detachment was a Cherokee-led detachment. The early detachments that left were suffering so many casualties. People were dying before they left. People were dying along the route. People were being murdered along the route, and it was a horrendous hardship. They were not receiving the provisions they were needing. There were many letters where the conductors were asking for more money for provisions, and they were turned down. And so Nathaniel Guest Richard Guest was one of the leaders, one of the conductors of the bench detachment. So if you go into the cave, if you make that trip into the cave, you're going to see where Richard signed the cave wall in two different places. He was also the author of the Sequoyah Syllabary that was in the wall, that's on the walls of the cave in some of the places. Now the syllabary, a lot of people think they're going to go in and they're just going to see this big wall and it's just got all this syllabary written on it. It's not. It's broken up into several places through the cave, and it even goes into the dark part of the cave that the tour can't transverse. Like the trail ends, you got to be an experienced caver to get there. Okay, so some of it is not visible, but some of it is visible, and you will see the signatures on the cave wall if you take the tour. The inscription was written on April the 30th, 1828, and as many people have discussed before, there were European pressures from the missionaries, from the preachers, from the federal government to conform, to stop your ceremony, to stop your way of life, and so those ceremonies from the inscriptions inside the cave went underground. And so this is not lore. This was translated from the syllabary written on the cave. And I want to say this. It was a unique three-tribe interaction to translate the syllabary. The Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, the United Kituwa Band, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians were all collaborating on that transcription. Some of the inscriptions have not been translated to the public. They have only been translated to the tribes because so much of their culture was erased by the knowledge of it being out there. And so keeping some of those ceremonies and the spiritual parts of the inscription private to just the elders and the spiritual leaders of the tribes is what has been decided on the cave. What we do know is that Richard was talking about a stickball tournament that was taking place. And I think Sharon said you could be sitting on a place for a stickball tournament. But there are certain ceremonies and certain rites that stickball players go through to prepare for a tournament. And we don't know who was playing who. We don't know if it was intertribal or intra-tribal, or we have no idea. But we do know that he was inside the cave going through ceremony or rites with the stickball team because he says it. He also describes himself as a respectable man of authority. And so we see this in documents. He says it about himself, but we also see it in documents as he was chosen by the local Cherokee to be a conductor on the bench route, the bench detachment. Okay, so we know that Sequoyah's son was a leader in this community. And so even though Sequoyah left ahead of the official Trail of Tears, we know that his legacy through his son as a leader lived on. And we know that his daughter was very active in proving that the syllabary was truly language. And so it's fascinating to me that we don't talk very much about Sequoyah as a father. Okay, we don't, we know that the Cherokee lineage was very matriarchal and centered around the mothers, but Sequoyah as a father, that's an interesting concept for his character. Obviously, very interactive with his children, as you can tell through their lives. And so we don't think about that very often. But anyway, so Richard, like I said, as you can see his handwriting. You can see his signature. You can see the date that he signed the cave wall, and I think that's fantastic that you can even mark that on your calendar. You know the exact date he was standing there. A man called a Cherokee man from Georgia named the Goose. His name appears on a ceiling panel, and another name for him translates smoker. This is not fact, these are suggestions, scholarly suggestions that he might have been a person who could have been doing a cleansing, smoking in the cave. Again, we're not sure that has been in some of the scholarly publications. He writes that I am your grandson. And this is one of the inscriptions that were written backwards, indicating someone from the other side of the cave wall was reading it. So they were backwards from the Goose. And so there are several different scholarly publications that have come from the Cherokee that say that this could have been speaking to an ancestor. I'm your grandson, speaking to an ancestor on the other side. Traditional knowledge keepers and researchers continue to collaborate on the cave writings at Manitou and throughout the Southeast. And the knowledge about the context of these indigenous writers will continue to shed light on their ways of life and culture that they sought in refuge inside the underground world to preserve what otherwise could have been lost forever. So today, this year, we come together, the Cherokee Nation, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the United Kituwa Band. Everyone is officially celebrating this 200th year of the creation of the syllabary. And so we did not want to let this day go without making sure that we had paid honor to Sequoyah and his life here in Willstown, and the legacy that he left for generations and generations to come. So I want to thank you for being here. All right. That was great. Thank you. Annette wanted to say a few thank yous before we kind of close out our day. But I also want to, again, thank you for all for being here. Some of you came from very far. We have a Georgia Trail of Tears person. George, out there in the, I know we have Georgia Trail of Tears here. We have Missouri. Georgia, I recognize you ladies. Can you stand, please? These ladies have been I'm going to turn it back over to Annette so that she can round out our day. Again, I just Association, huge supporters, and the Alabama Humanities